Well, hi, my name's Meg, and this is my first YouTube video ever, so please bear with me. I don't usually do stuff like this, but I thought this was an important subject, so I wanted to talk to you about it and give you an opportunity to listen. This is actually my senior thesis project, and I presented this earlier this year, but I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to see it, and not just so that I'm telling you what I think about something, but so that you can think for yourself about this subject, which I think is important to think about. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Colorado. After I graduated high school in Aurora, I went to school at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. I started out as a psych major, changed my major a couple times, but landed on social work. I loved the material. I've always loved thinking about what makes people think and act the way that they do, and the topic I chose for my thesis was unplanned pregnancy. And there are a couple of reasons that I chose this topic for my thesis. One of them is my personal experiences with unplanned pregnancy. Although I've never had an unplanned pregnancy myself, I know a lot of people who have dealt with this issue, and oftentimes it's a very complex issue. It's a hard thing to go through, and I think a lot of the ways that we approach it, not just as a culture but as individuals, is not necessarily the best way to approach this issue. So what I wanted to investigate in my project is finding out, first of all, what is it like going through an unplanned pregnancy? And this is either you going through an unplanned pregnancy yourself, or going through it with a loved one or someone close in your life, or having a client that has gone through one before. And secondly, not just learning more about the experience of an unplanned pregnancy, but kind of learning from those experiences and finding out what is helpful to a woman going through an unplanned pregnancy and what is not, and how we as a society and as a culture can approach this issue in a more fair way. So what I focus on in this study is the issue of justice. How can we approach unplanned pregnancy in a way that's fair, in a way that is just, and in a way that's helpful? So my main research question in my thesis was, how do our unique roles in unplanned pregnancy contribute to our understanding of justice? So in other words, how do our own personal experiences with unplanned pregnancy or someone who's gone through it contribute to the way that we see justice in this situation, and therefore what we think would be a fair approach to the issue? So I'll start off by just giving you a little bit of background on the issue itself. So my first question is social work related, since my degree was in social work, and that's kind of the perspective I'm taking of the issue. So what you see here is pretty much the Bible of social work. It's from the National Association of Social Work's Code of Ethics. This is just a small little section of the Code of Ethics, but it pretty much shows the core values of social work. So as you can see here, there's service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. So these are the things that we want social workers in our society to really know about, because once you know about these things, that's what makes a good social worker. I wanted to point this out, just the aspect of human worth. So people are valuable. People matter in the world. There's something special about them that if someone in their life is hurt, or a life is lost, or there's some injustice done to someone, that really matters. It's something that we should care about. So human worth is preeminent, unconditional. It doesn't matter, for instance, your gender, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, how much you contribute to society even. You, as a human being, and any other human being, has dignity and worth, and there's nothing that can take that away. So now I want to talk about what is justice. This is a question that I deliberately do not answer in my thesis or in this presentation. I think a lot of people, if you ask them what justice was, and this is what I found out in my research too, they would define justice differently. And since this is such a core value of social work, I thought it was worth investigating what does justice really mean. And so instead of just giving you a straight answer, I want you to find that answer for yourself. After looking at my research, I'm hoping that maybe you'll get closer to some kind of maybe objective definition of justice. I don't know if you're familiar with the words connotation and denotation, but the word denotation is kind of a dictionary definition of a word, and then a connotation is more of an emotional understanding of a word, a more practical application of it, and it's a little bit more subjective. So when trying to define the word justice, it's important to look at our perceptions of justice, how they formed, and how they affect the way that we think and the way that we act. So there's actually been a lot of studies on justice and the way that people define it and the way that they see it interacting in their lives. One such study was by Claudia Dalbert, and she found out that our perceptions of justice as human beings affect not only our attitudes toward past injustice, so maybe, for instance, the belief in karma, that if you have done something wrong, that there's punishment for you, and that's the reason that something happened in your life. Or maybe the same thing towards someone who offended you in your life, maybe that they deserve somehow to be punished for that. Also, perceptions of justice affect our responses to complex social situations. So, for example, she did a couple studies on someone who got cancer, and just trying to find out, well, why does this happen? This is a question we ask a lot as human beings in the face of suffering. Why did this happen? Kind of wondering what or who is to blame, and maybe how to make up for it, how to relieve that suffering, and how to set things right. Mainly, justice has been studied in the fields of policy and law, organizational psychology, and clinical psychology, but it hasn't really been studied a whole lot in applied practice, so a social work setting, for instance, or maybe a counseling setting. Hasn't been studied as much, at least. Here's some examples of ways that people might see justice. Sometimes they see it as meeting some kind of need. Maybe it's someone in poverty and they have a need, and justice would be meeting their needs and giving them food. There's a social exchange, behavioral balance, facing consequences, or some kind of restoration. So kind of this aspect of restoring balance or what was once lost in some way or another. Justice is also related to legal responsibility, social and moral responsibility, and also our religious or philosophical worldview. So our beliefs about who we are as human beings, why we're here, whether or not there's a God or gods, and what our purpose is in life, those affect our perceptions of justice, according to traditional justice theories. So, of all topics, how does justice relate to unplanned pregnancy? Well, that's what I investigate in my study. So here we go. This diagram is something that if you're a social worker, it kind of gets beat into your head. It's one of those really foundational diagrams. It's from a theory called the systems theory, and it's a way to map out a society, pretty much. So when you're dealing with a client, you have your client, which is the microsystem. You have the people surrounding him or her very closely, so their primary group, their family, maybe their romantic partner. your exosystem is even higher than that. It's maybe the school that they go to, some kind of religious group, a club that they're in, and so on. And then the macrosystem is really big, so like the existence of different religions, or things that have happened in history, or cultural norms, the media, and the government. So in this diagram in particular, you see that the unborn is put in there in dotted lines, and I don't intend to say anything about whether the unborn is human or not in this study. That's not what I'm investigating, but I put that in there because the unborn is something that is very crucial in the topic of unplanned pregnancy, and certain people will fit the unborn in different aspects of this social system diagram depending on what they believe about whether the unborn is a human being or a part of the mother's body or whatever. So I put that there just to show that currently there are different beliefs about what the unborn is, and that affects our beliefs about justice in the case of unplanned pregnancy. Okay, so now we have some statistics. So these are the unplanned pregnancy rates in the United States. Overall, almost 1/2 of pregnancies in our country are unplanned. A little less than 2/3 of those, of people who are between 20 and 24, when they get pregnant, it was not something they were planning. And usually people who are younger than 20 years old, if they get pregnant, only 20% of them had actually planned to get pregnant. So these are some factors associated with unplanned pregnancy. Just a quick note, unplanned pregnancy doesn't necessarily cause these things, neither do these things cause unplanned pregnancy, of course. They're factors that are associated with people who have unplanned pregnancies. So a lot of women who find themselves unexpectedly pregnant do not have a lot of education, don't have a huge income. Many people are unmarried or cohabiting, and actually a high number of them are African American women. Some other correlations. The correlation that I found here in another study that I found is that women who have unplanned pregnancies tend to have mental health problems. So maybe depression or anxiety or stress, things like that. But this happens regardless of their pregnancy outcome. So no matter what that woman decides to do with her pregnancy, she is at risk for things like depression and anxiety. And so that's something that social workers and people who care for these women need to take note of, because just because she might seem sure about a certain decision or confident in that decision doesn't necessarily mean that there's not something going on where she could use some extra help in terms of her mental health. Alright, so some other risk factors for the mother or for the woman who is pregnant. If her pregnancy is unplanned, she's at special risk for depression, stress, experiencing physical violence in a relationship, or just general relationship instability, low support from the father, and low social support in general. So this is compared to a woman who had a planned pregnancy. So these women whose pregnancies aren't planned, it's generally more of an unstable situation. For the child, if that child does end up being born, that child is at risk for low birth weight, poor mental health, himself or herself, and also experiencing family turmoil. These are risks that researchers have found to be higher in unplanned pregnancy cases. So now I'm going to get into some of the details of my actual research process. So in my thesis, what I did is I interviewed 7 people. These were my participants. And here's a little bit of information about them. 4 of them were women, 3 were men. There's a variety of age ranges. A couple more of them were either 24 or younger, and 3 of them were above 30 years old. As for involvement, this kind of relates to their unique role in an unplanned pregnancy. So 3 of the people I interviewed were professionals. They had been professionally involved with unplanned pregnancy, either working at a clinic or being some kind of counselor or advocate. Volunteers were people who were involved with unplanned pregnancy cases but didn't get paid for them, had a volunteer position, and oftentimes didn't necessarily have a degree in social work or counseling or medicine, but still helped out. And then the other 2 were not professionals, not involved professionally in unplanned pregnancy. So 3 of the people I interviewed had unplanned pregnancies themselves, and 4 of the people had someone close to them in their lives experience an unplanned pregnancy. So this is about getting consent from people to participate in the interview. I used a process that was approved by the Institutional Review Board. I went through proper procedures there to protect the identities of the people I interviewed and also make sure that they were voluntarily participating in my study. So if you want to read my thesis, that's in Appendix E. So each participant participated in 2 interviews. The first one was usually about an hour long. It was either on the phone or in person, and it was recorded. I used 7 questions that were the same for each person, but generally I wanted people to be able to elaborate on what they cared about most, so that I wasn't just like imposing my beliefs on them or making them respond how I wanted them to, that it was really just a free response. Then after that there was a follow-up interview, usually a few weeks afterwards, and what I did between then is transcribed the interview, and then I sent it to the interviewee, and we met, they read over it just to make sure that the way that they answered the questions was what they were really meaning to say. They were free to elaborate or make any changes that they wanted to. This was to make sure that they felt confident about what they were saying, but also just make sure that I was understanding what they were trying to say. There were basically 3 different sections of the interview. The first was just about initial perceptions of unplanned pregnancy. What do you think of when you hear the word unplanned pregnancy? And then also what kind of beliefs exist in society about this issue. So it was a little bit more general. The second part of the interview was more kind of getting into more personally, what is your experience with unplanned pregnancy? And then also, what were the important systems that gave that woman support? And what were some barriers to her receiving support in that circumstance? So they described one particular example that they went through and then kind of analyzed it. So the third part of the interview was more about, it was a little bit more abstract. It was about how did you see injustice in the situation, if at all? Do you feel like there's any justice in the situation, and how could the people involved in this situation been treated more fairly? So after the interviews were recorded and transcribed, I teamed up with a doctoral student in Colorado Springs. Her name was Lori Buchanan, and we codified the information. So we got together different categories to make the information a little bit more systematic in the way that it was analyzed, and help reduce some of the bias that may have been there if I had just analyzed it myself. This also allowed me to find more similarities and differences in the interviews in a more systematic way. So now we get to the fun part. This is the results of the study. So the first thing that I analyzed about these interviews was from the first section of the interview about what do you think of when you think of unplanned pregnancy. There were 3 different ways that people reacted. They had some kind of emotional reaction. They thought about maybe the situational implications of unplanned pregnancy. So it was less about, oh my gosh, I feel this way, but more about, oh man, that would involve such and such. And then there was also a social reaction. So maybe some kind of like, we need to do something about this, or society treats unplanned pregnancy like so. So here's some examples. And again, these names are not the actual names of the people I interviewed, but they are fake names. So this was from a teen father, and he had an emotional response. He said, it strikes fear in you. You're like, oh man, it's going to change my life forever, and it's terrifying. So he kind of reacted with, wow, when I think of unplanned pregnancy, it's scary. The next reaction was a social reaction. This is from a post-abortion counselor. She says, I think there's a lot our society could do to address the issue, so kind of thinking about prevention. And then there's the situational reaction. So this medical professional, she was thinking about everything involved, financial stability, relationship stability, a woman trying to figure out what kind of choices she can make, and also talking about whether or not that woman is educated on all of her different options and how that affects her decision about the pregnancy. But she says no matter what her decision is, it's life-changing. So the next part of what I investigated and what I analyzed was their belief about justice. So there were 6 different categories where people related unplanned pregnancy to justice. So one of them was politics. So this woman's advocate kind of took a political standpoint. She saw politics really having a bearing on how people see this issue. She said the whole liberal versus conservative difference, it kind of divides people on what they believe in the issue. One of the main questions that I asked during this part of the interview is what kind of beliefs exist in society that divide people on their perspective of unplanned pregnancy. So a lot of these answers kind of relate to that question. This is from a young single mother. She's talking about a family that kind of took her in while she was going through her pregnancy. At the end of her quote, she says, they didn't have to take me in, but they did. So kind of taking a moral standpoint that, wow, that's really cool that they did that, even though they didn't really have to. The next is religion or philosophy, just about the world. This guy was a human and civil rights activist. He said a lot of people think religion affects their beliefs about unplanned pregnancy, and that also kind of related to moral issues, that what you believe about the world and why we're here kind of affects what you think is moral or not. Also, views about sexuality affected justice belief. So this man, he was actually born out of an unplanned pregnancy. And he says, some people are like, how could you possibly live without having sex? And then he says, but I feel like you can still live and be happy without having sex. So maybe he's talking about sexuality in certain contexts and whether it has a certain place. Also the issue of personhood. So what does it mean to be a person? Who is a person, and what value does somebody have as a person versus maybe an animal or something living that's not necessarily a person. This post-abortion counselor, she said that she believes we're not teaching biology to the culture, so she thinks that personhood is maybe rooted in some kind of biological answer that we can discover about what makes a person a person. this is also very closely connected to the issue of human worth. Actually, she went on to say, "We're failing to say if this is a living, growing human being, they deserve as much right to continue their life as we have." So she's talking about the unborn here and saying if the unborn is a human being, then they have the same rights as any other human being. And because she had that belief, that affected the way that she interacted with unplanned pregnancy. So next, what we analyzed were different categories of support. So where did a woman receive support? What kind of support did she receive? Was it helpful? Was it hurtful? And what were maybe her barriers to getting the support that she either would have needed or would have benefited from? So first, it was agency support. And what we found here was that when a woman was helped by an agency, she often received support from that agency. Oftentimes, though, she was also stigmatized, maybe felt isolated, and same with society. Society would either support her in her unplanned pregnancy and how she was kind of wrestling with her choices. Sometimes she was stigmatized and kind of kept from investigating a lot of her choices, or just generally felt isolated. And then there's the client herself, or the woman herself who was dealing with the pregnancy. In the stories told, she would usually either interact with an agency, some kind of organization, interact with society around her, and of course interact with her own conflicts going on inside herself. So here is what Rob said about stigmatization. He's talking about a woman in his life. We're just going to call her Chelsea. She went through an unplanned pregnancy, and he said people weren't willing to be a friend to her. They were judgmental, not necessarily outwardly, but in the sense of being passive or not wanting to talk to her. So we categorize that as some kind of stigmatization. Susie talked about internal conflict, and although she was a medical professional, she had actually faced an unplanned pregnancy herself. And she said that she told me a story of when she was younger, she had had an abortion. And in this quote, she's talking about how she felt after that. She says, "I became a very angry person. I hated myself. I would have had another child and I couldn't get around it. I had a lot of anxiety, compared myself to other women, how they mothered, how I fail as a mother." She had had more kids by this time, but I didn't talk to anyone about it. So here she was having this internal conflict even after she had made a decision, and she just felt like she couldn't talk to anybody about it, which made her very anxious, it seems. Caleb talked about agency support. His mother was dealing with an unplanned pregnancy, and he's talking about her interaction with the doctor. So as soon as his parents found out they were going to have him, his mom went to the doctor. His mom didn't believe in abortion, but pretty much what they said to her was, "What day do you want to have the abortion?" He said they didn't even really talk to her about it. They didn't really investigate what she really believed and what she wanted to do with her pregnancy. They just kind of assumed. Social support. Ethan talked about when he first found out that his girlfriend was pregnant. He says, "I went and bought ice cream, and then he and his friends all went back, and she literally just sat in her room and cried." Her parents didn't know about it yet. After a while, after they had sat with her best friends left. He said at one point they kind of just had a moment, and after a while, they were sitting there, and she said, "I think we should tell my parents," and he said, "Yep, let's do it." That was a way that they were trying to gain social support, or maybe just keep from being isolated from their parents. So there's a lot more of these quotes in the thesis. I encourage you to read it, take a look at it. Even if you don't read the whole thing, I I highly encourage you to read some of the quotes that are in there. I think they're very insightful. There's a lot of different perspectives that I investigated, and I think it can help you to understand maybe some blind spots that you have in the issue, or ways that you could increase your understanding of the issue just by reading from people who've really dealt with it and finding out what they think of the issue. Anyway, here's a quick summary of the conclusion that I found in my project. I'm going to talk about aspects of justice that were discussed, suggestions for practice, so if you're a counselor or a social worker, or even if you just know somebody who is dealing with an unplanned pregnancy and you want to help them, I have some suggestions here based on the research, and also for research purposes, some different directions that my research could go in the future. So this is kind of just a summary of the diagrams that I talked about. When thinking of unplanned pregnancy, people generally reacted with an emotional reaction, a situational consideration, or a social consideration. Institutional beliefs surrounding these systems included politics, morality, religion and philosophy, beliefs about sexuality, beliefs about personhood, and beliefs about human worth. And then the last diagram was just about justice and whether it was present or absent in influential support systems. So the woman might have experienced justice or some kind of injustice in her agency, at least from the interviewee's standpoint. She may have experienced some injustice from society, and that she might have also felt stigmatized or isolated because of the way that these institutions reacted to her pregnancy. And based on whether she felt supported, stigmatized, or isolated, she had some kind of internal conflict where in these stories that the interviewees would tell, that women usually would be dealing with some kind of conflict about, even though this agency or society says this, how do I really feel? What am I feeling right now? Do I feel like I can make the decision that I want to make, or maybe I don't feel empowered, and just kind of having this internal conflict. So this is probably my favorite part of my whole thesis. Here's 7 steps that I think that we could all use, that we could all take to pursue justice in the case of unplanned pregnancy. So the first is just our attitude toward pregnancy. In the first question that I asked, what do you think of when you think of unplanned pregnancy? And I think a lot of people can be judgmental toward the issue, and a lot of the people I interviewed found some kind of injustice with this judgmental attitude. And so some of them would say it'd be better to empathize with the woman and to really understand where she's coming from and meet her where she's at. Also, the way that we uphold self-determination. So this is a social worky term. It means pretty much allowing other human beings to make their own choices. And this is really tough in the situation of unplanned pregnancy because a lot of people believe that the unborn is also a human being, and the woman's choice in the case of an unplanned pregnancy can override that choice. Other people, maybe parents, would want to make a decision for the woman, or maybe a romantic partner would try to make a decision for that woman and just pressure her into making some kind of decision. And people generally found that not necessarily the decision itself, but the fact that this woman was being pressured even above and beyond what she really believed, they thought that was an injustice. So a better way to approach this would be to explore a woman's values, what she really thinks about herself, what she wants to do with her life, the kind of person that she wants to be, and helping her make a decision that she'll be proud of in the end. The next one is helping approach. So a lot of people would talk about superficial solutions that they didn't think were adequate. Connie, the post-abortion counselor, she talked about how people would often say things to women that really weren't helpful, to try to get rid of their guilt or kind of just gloss over these feelings that they were feeling deep inside. And she didn't find that to be really helpful. So she said a better way to approach it is to understand really how is this affecting this woman. If she's feeling guilty or anxious, why is she feeling that way, and really looking into those kind of things. The next one is the treatment of human life. One woman talked about how, in general, we can devalue human life. So again, this isn't just about the unborn. It may not be about the unborn at all, if the unborn isn't a human being, but just generally treating people as less than human. So for example, if a woman is going through an unplanned pregnancy and she's just kind of overlooked, maybe she's abused in a relationship, just not treated fairly, that is an injustice, and that's what the interviewee said. And they said that a better way to approach this would be to cherish all human life, to understand the value of human life, which kind of goes back to some of the values in the Code of Ethics. Empowerment principles. So empowerment means not necessarily doing something for somebody, but kind of allowing them to make decisions on their own, be, I guess, their own person, and have a life that they'd want to have, even if they might be afraid or might not know if they have enough support to do what they want to do. So instead of submitting to just what statistics say or what society says usually happens to people, one way we can empower women is to tell them, you know what, you're not a statistic. You can make your own choice, and giving her support in what she wants to do and saying, this is what might happen, but there's so much more that's possible for you in your life. Restoring justice, again, one aspect that people thought about in justice was some kind of restoration, some kind of balance. People tended to see punishment as an injustice. So, for example, if someone thought that getting pregnant out of wedlock was wrong, that they should just own up and they should just deal with it, and their life's kind of just going to suck. They didn't think that that was very fair. But instead, a better way to do that is to pursue reconciliation, to say, well, hey, maybe this wasn't right, maybe it was totally okay, but what we need to do here is find out what we can do, find out how we can do the best for all human beings involved. And finally, social and community action. A lot of people will neglect the need that has arisen. One thing I forgot to mention is that in the case of an unplanned pregnancy, no matter what you think of the unborn, a new social need is introduced. There's more of a need that needs to be addressed, and neglecting that need will cause some kind of imbalance in that social system, and usually someone is going to suffer because of that. But if we share the responsibility as a society and do what we can in the life of a woman with an unplanned pregnancy, then that need can usually be met, and we can bring some kind of restoration to that system so that there isn't unnecessary suffering that happens. So here's the research aspect. There's a couple limitations of my study, of course, there always are. My study was a case study interview. It investigated 7 specific instances, but it couldn't determine relationships that might exist between helping role and justice belief. So a future research question would be, what's the specific nature of the relationship between the helping role and justice belief? So instead of just taking all these different situations with all these different variables, saying, okay, what do people working at a pregnancy center usually think about justice? Or what do people who are the parents of a pregnant woman usually think about justice? Next, the study revealed a relationship between institutional belief and perceptions of justice, but it can't really tell us much about the specific nature of that relationship, so whether they correlate at all or anything. So one way to fix that, or to pursue more information about that, is studying how macro level conditions affect interaction. So let's say it's a really rural conservative environment, how does that affect justice versus if it's a really urban or liberal environment? How does that affect how agencies and society affect that woman? And finally, participants mentioned the importance of natural helpers, so people who aren't professionals, but just that even family members or friends can be really significant in a woman's decision about her pregnancy and how the rest of her life goes. So, but the study couldn't really provide evidence for which empowerment methods are most effective, and I would love to learn more about how maybe me as a natural helper, if I had a friend who's dealing with an unplanned pregnancy, what would be the best way to help her? What things should I say to her to make her feel supported, and what things might I be saying to her that are making her feel isolated or judged or conflicted about the choices that she's facing? So that's the end of my presentation, but I thank you for listening. Again, I'm going to put a copy up of the actual thesis for you to read. I encourage you to check it out. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and you're awesome.